We have been seeking to raise the word and world connection as we think about an adequate gospel in the complexity of the modern world. Taking culture seriously is not always easy. I think to take some of the mystery out of research, if that is there for some people who are trained theologically or are pastors, research is simply like doing an inductive Bible study. It is to move in and to discover what is there. It is to look for meaning, and it is to project application. What does it say? What does it mean? And how can it be applied? And we've been raising and contending that we must look at the culture with fresh eyes, in a sense be missiologists in order to be effective in ministry. I would suggest that to ignore the culture, if we have a concern for the life of the church, would be something like being a Canadian and ignoring the weather. We give more attention and are more eloquent on the subject of the weather than any other people on the face of the earth, particularly when we deal with climates like today. I have been amused about thinking about the incident where Betty Crocker was wanting to establish a new product in Japan. And as a cake company, they designed a cake to be cooked in Japanese rice cookers. They did not, in their marketing analysis, realize that for the Japanese, rice has a sacred quality about it. And so the people of Japan were reticent to use the cake mix for fear that it would contaminate the rice. So we know what happened to that product. It was a multi-million-dollar flop. It is to say we must take culture seriously, whether we are talking about Japan or Canada. Now, believe it or not, the government is even a model for us in a measure. I'm not sure if you're aware of the idea or not, but in the Northwest Territories, it is possible to make alimony payments by giving your former spouse caribou or blubber. And we may smile at that, but it is really saying to us that, in fact, there are culturally appropriate ways. There is currency in the culture in the North that is appropriate to that situation. This evening, we are committed to the text, announce biblical clarity, a clear voice in a you-decide world. Initially, I would like to put alongside the issue of biblical clarity the need and the desire to also be biblically unpredictable. For when we think about clarity, we have thoughts of accuracy, of being definitive and truthful and even lucidly clear in our communication. And all that is virtuous and commendable. But we can also be committed to clarity and end up by being textually valid and technically correct, but also biblically boring. And out of a concern to escape being profoundly stale in our exegesis or our hermeneutical interpretation as we pick up the Scriptures and seek to make sense out of who God is and what Christ has done, out of a desire to escape what has often been termed deadly orthodoxy, it is to invite us not only to clarity but also to unpredictability. That is, as we pick up the text, as we seek to mine the mind of God for the truth of God to apply to this age, we would look for elements of surprise, that we would somehow see that there are intriguing revelations here for us, that biblical interpretation includes fascination. It invites innovation. And in fact, if we are to connect the Word with the world, we will have a commitment to be contextually relevant. And perhaps one of the invitations of tonight is for us to pray for creativity as we pick up the text, to try to communicate what is eternal into the contemporary reality of today's world. This is particularly true because there are some issues that are converging on the Scriptures that are challenging the power of the written Word. The believability of the Bible is under jeopardy because of a cultural convergence that is undermining confidence in what has historically given confidence to the people of God. Since the 1960s, we have been living with anti-authority biases. And instead of being open to external authority, be that God or prime ministers or principals or men to women and women to men, we've been moving into a modus operandum for life where we say, I will decide, thank you very much. I will be a law unto myself. And so when we think about what the culture is communicating to us about attitudes regarding sources of authority, to pick this book up and to say this is the authoritative Word of God is to counter one of the prevailing moods in our time. That is also true because we have prevailing anti-truth assumptions in today's world. Last evening, we talked briefly about the presence of relativism, the human prerogative in this age to reduce truth to a matter of personal opinion. And so as we again pick up this revelation and suggest that this is a statement of truth from the Creator and Redeemer of the world, we are just as apt to hear people say, well, that's your opinion, as to solicit a sense of respect for the historical view of the Scriptures. One of the other cultural convergences that is challenging the believability of the Bible in this age is that we are experiencing what we might label an ideological decline. That is to say, a love for ideas is being preempted by an appetite for experience. It is to think about the heart and the head, Malcolm, that you referred to, and to understand that in the modern world, the hunger of the heart is exceeding the hunger of the head. But this, you see, is a book of ideas. It is an invitation for us to understand who we are and why we are here, how we are to live, and what we can anticipate after life on earth is ended. But this book that gives us a distinct worldview exists in a world that would prefer to feel rather than think. Now, that isn't to say that we have given up on thinking or that we are completely irrational, but it is to make a case to say that in the modern world we are intellectually selective, that there are times when we reach for a switch to turn the mind on in socially appropriate situations or in educational institutions. But as we turn on the CD or flip on the television and go channel hopping, we are just as likely to turn that switch off that activates the mind as a source of perception in today's world. And so when we see the convergence of these particular forces and pressures and pulls in contemporary life, I would suggest to us that although the Scriptures stand with integrity in the context of the modern world, there are pressures that are threatening the power of this book. Now, some of you who preach with conviction on Sunday morning will want to take issue with that. To ask the question, are you suggesting that God's Word is no longer reliable? I'm trying to say to us that there are converging circumstances in the culture that are challenging the force, the energy, the receptivity to what this book claims to be. And if that is the case, and if we are concerned to be audience sensitive in our communication, we will somehow understand how the audience views the book, rather than those of us who communicate from it project our understandings of the book. I would like this evening to address two areas of clarity and creativity. One is to acknowledge that as we seek to be meaning makers of this eternal revelation into our contemporary world, that we can find direction, we can have clarity in the midst of social complexity, and we also can find in this book an invitation to be creative and to discover intrigue in the messages that can be communicated to today's world. One of the marks of the modern world is that we are being subject to an onslaught of diversity. There is a disarray of differences that are invading the present tense compared to the stability of the past. It is not unusual in most parts of the country for us to go to public school Christmas concerts and discover that the traditional Christmas carols have been downsized to Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, with little or no room for Away in the Manger. We heard a comment earlier today in our discussion that we no longer have the Lord's Prayer or distinctive Christian prayers in our public schools. We have had recent debates in Quebec over Muslim headdress, and in the West over turbans on RCMP officers and in other places. There is a whole series of sexuality issues that make for good primetime television and front-page news. Whether it is homosexuality or abortion, issues relating to same-sex couples, these become a matter of current events for us. We, for the first time in our history, have people going to the courts requesting that they can choose when to die. And the issue of euthanasia or mercy killing is one that has arrived, and it's going to stay on our agenda for some time. For those of us who have our identities and our understanding of public life rooted in a Christian consensus, we are feeling pressured and pulled by the increasing disarray of differences that pull us in one direction. Our multi-voice society asking for legitimacy for voices that were quiet in the past. And the question I would ask for us is, how can we live peaceably and productively with our increasing diversity? And more specifically, how can we construct a society that allows us to live with strong convictions while giving the same prerogative to others to live as we desire to live? And in the midst of the diversity that swirls around us, can we find biblical direction to help us communicate clearly and be faithful in our messaging and our living in the modern world? I would like to suggest to us that the Scriptures do speak. And in Jesus' life we have numerous prototypes for how to deal with the complexity of the age. And briefly, I would like to invite us to think about the incident in John chapter 8. It occurred during Jesus' public ministry. He too was faced with complexities swirling around him. And that profound dilemma is given to us understandably in a section of Scripture that is subject to scholarly debate. For it is often footnoted or in italics in our New Testaments, and it is absent from our earliest manuscripts. But I would suggest to us that the incident in Jesus' public ministry when the woman caught in adultery was brought to him is totally consistent with Jesus' attitudes and his behaviors throughout his complete public ministry. And the incident gives us insight for how we can handle some of the social complexity that faces us in this age and will continue to hound us in the coming years. I'm going to assume a certain amount of biblical literacy in this room and not read the complete text. And I will assume that my assumption is valid. If anyone would like to disagree, I would be happy to hear your dissent. But in this situation, Jesus is teaching in the public forum. And as he is doing so, he is interrupted. A woman is brought and accused of being an adulterous woman. People who have concern for gender equality in this age often ask, and where was the man? And it is a very just question. But in the text, it's only the woman who is brought. Her accusers threaten to stone her. It's a complex situation because according to the law, they have the prerogative to do what they desire to do to the woman. But can we look at how Jesus responds? The first observation is to realize that Jesus exists in this situation with a strong sense of personal identity. All through his life, Jesus knew who he was. There is no ambivalence about his self-perception. It was Jesus who said confidently, "I and the Father are one." We remember the I am declarations of Jesus. I am the door. I am the bread of life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And in this particular passage, in the verse that follows the incident, we hear Jesus saying to himself, I am the light of the world. One thing we are certain about is that Jesus was not stifled by an inferiority complex. Waffling was never Jesus' way. But what happens is that out of his strong sense of identity, Jesus is able to act with decisiveness. He's able to project assurance and conviction in his situation. I suggest to us, ladies and gentlemen, that in the midst of our cultural multi-mindedness, it will be helpful if we can have a clear sense of personal identity. Self-definition, self-perception with which we are comfortable. Because if we live on that foundation, we will be able to not only self-project with a sense of confidence, we will not be threatened by other people who are different from us. Also in this situation, what happens is that Jesus de-escalates an emotionally charged situation. The accusing crowd has a malicious agenda. It is not their earnest desire to obey the law that is really their motivation. Their real target was Jesus. The situation was a setup. The woman was a pawn. She was just there as an opportune object to entrap Jesus. They wanted to get Jesus to contradict Moses so they could build up a case against them. And so they come with a devious agenda. And it's in this agenda that Jesus takes charge. And with a sense of theatrical flair, after the woman is brought, and they ask for Jesus' permission to in fact stone her and take her life, the scriptures say that Jesus bows on his knees and he writes in the sand. Now, commentators have had all kinds of interpretations of what Jesus was doing there. Was he writing names in the sand? I would suggest that Jesus was thinking to himself, this is a serious problem, and what he was doing was buying time. In the humanness of his life, he was reflecting on how to respond. And he stands in a moment of divine brilliance. Instead of throwing tear gas into the crowd to incite more anger, Jesus de-escalates the situation. Instead of increasing the emotional temperature of the event, the intensity is de-escalated. I would suggest that in the midst of social polarization around some of the current issues, be they about abortion or other issues, that this principle from Jesus is one that should invite our serious consideration. Not only is there de-escalation in an emotionally charged situation, but Jesus protects the vulnerable person in the situation. You know, while the mob are congratulating themselves about their self-righteousness, Jesus turns that situation and has them think about their own sin. But it's in this situation that Jesus is the peacemaker. You know, he doesn't dial 911 for police backup, but he disarms the thugs without raising his voice by turning the situation back on the accusers. But in this situation, Jesus is predictably redemptive. He lives out the meaning of the cross before he surrenders himself to die on the cross. You see, Jesus' life on earth is given to the same purpose as his death on earth. He is compelled to translate the brokenness of people's lives into new patterns. Anything else is a sham for Jesus. And in this situation, both the disgraced crowd and the humiliated woman are allowed to escape their ruin and begin again. Jesus protects the vulnerable person. Is there a principle for us as we think about the complexities of our own time? What is especially compelling about Jesus in this situation is that he embraces both conviction and compassion. Jesus' first instinct is to be compassionate. His heart reaches out to the woman. She is the one who is facing the death threats. The crowd wants Jesus to come over to their side. They want his endorsement so they can apply the letter of the law. But Jesus says no to legalism. His compassion compels him to stand with the woman. He's more concerned about giving the woman a fresh start than he is about the staining of his own reputation by associating with her. You see, Jesus understood that everyone in the situation was in need of grace and mercy. And so compassion pulls Jesus in one direction, but at the same time, Jesus is pulled toward conviction. Jesus knows that sin is wrong, that legalism is destructive and immorality is evil. But in this situation, Jesus is not afraid of sin. He's not reticent about calling sin by name because he knows it can be dealt with. But there is a balance in Jesus' life. Conviction obligates Jesus. In a direct way, he says to the woman, "Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again." But it's the tenderness of his compassion that also says to the woman, "Where are your accusers?" The woman answers, "They are not here." In realizing that she is not condemned, Jesus says to her, "Neither do I condemn you." Ladies and gentlemen, in my observation of Canadian Christians, there appears to be a predictable pattern. People who live with strong convictions, who have an exceedingly clear self-definition of who they are, often live with very little compassion. And it is people who are touched with compassion, who are empathetic, who have the ability to see the other person's point of view. It is the compassionate people who often have very limited or low-scale conviction. And what Jesus does for us is to give us the pattern for living in socially complex times where moral issues are on the agenda and right and wrong is a matter of personal perspective. He lives with compassion for those who are different from himself, but it does not jeopardize his own commitments and his own expressions of conviction. But as we think about these issues in this age, can we see that what Jesus does for everyone in the situation is that he offers fresh beginnings? The good news of the gospel is that in the face of messing up life, the message is get on with life. The cross is not about making people pay for their sins or their misjudgments or their laziness or their selfishness or their victimization or foolish choices or their blatant self-righteousness. The death of Christ is about restoration. It is about beginning again. It is about getting on with life. You see, the cross is God's powerful move in history to make peace with an alienated creation. In some profound and ultimately unexplainable fashion, the cross is morally charged with goodness and the ultimate answer to evil. But it is an expression of God's mercy and grace. It's divine strategy that transcends human logic. And in the end, the cross is an instrument of justice. In God's design, Jesus' surrender to death and triumph in the resurrection is an invitation to deal with the past and to get on with life. It is a beautiful sight. It is something that God's people can uniquely take into the spirit and brokenness and darkness of 1990s life. Now, how do we do that? As we think about people in our own lives who are different from ourselves, as we think about the diversity that swirls around us, what attitudes are we to extend and express in this age? I would suggest that it's possible to look at modern Canada and see that Canadians are responding to differences and disagreements around them in 5 different ways. The first way is to seek to reclaim and convert. There are a sizable number of Christian Canadians who unabashedly would like to turn back the clock. They would like to return to memories and a time when we were a more Christian Canada. They would like to see the Lord's Prayer back in our schools and compulsory Christian education in the curriculum. They lament the fact that Canada is the one Western world without abortion legislation. They point to increasing access to pornography as a symbol of moral decay. This may be a worthy intention, but the harsh reality is that looking back with nostalgia and pining for life as it used to be is simply not an option. We will not be returning to the past. Reclaiming yesterday will be a futile journey. But people still want to reclaim. They are characterized with "we were here first" attitudes. They live with a sense of cultural seniority. They look at immigrants in castigating terms. And how all of us who fall into that pattern have such short memories because, except for Aboriginal Canadians, we are all immigrants, even in Acadia land. Reclaimers also live with the idea, not just that we were here first, but my way is the right way. They live with a sense of cultural superiority. I am not judging the intent, because the intent frequently has the right aspiration. But as Leslie Newbigin says to us, nostalgia for Christendom is very understandable, but it is futile. Reclaimers, people who seek to convert. The second possible response for us to look at is to understand people who are tribalizers. They live to confront. Tribalizers are probably best demonstrated in the current milieu as people who identify with either pro-life or pro-choice alternatives. Tribalizers look through a very narrow window. It is their window. Tribalizers have deep convictions. They are not committed to convert, they are committed to confront. They cannot hear other people's points of view. I would suggest to us that the present state of our federal parliament is an expression of tribalization. We have the Bloc Québécois as our official representative with one clear-cut agenda. There is not listening, there is not negotiation. To further express our tribalization, the Reform Party, although they do not have the same degree of balkanization, the constituency they represent is fundamentally in the West, and it has a way of shredding society. Tribalizers, living with a single mindset that my way is the only way. There is a third alternative to think about in terms of response to diversity in our times, and it is to be an accommodator. That is to be inclusive. Accommodators are predisposed to expand the boundaries of their previous views to reach out and include people. Accommodators are non-judgmental people. They are prone to be permissive people. They can become concerned for justice issues when marginalized groups are at risk. But there is, in the spirit of the accommodator, a sense of being a cultural trendsetter. But they run the risk of simply contributing to cultural blending. Their zeal to embrace the next cause has a way of pulling life down to the lowest common denominator. Be inclusive. Be non-judgmental. Offer approval of anyone's views. The fourth category, really adapted from faith popcorn, would be that of being a cocooner. Unfortunately, this group probably represents the majority of Canadians. Cocooners live with a live and let live attitude. It's I'll live my way, you live your way. Cocooners are typified by attitudes that say, let's live together, but let's stay out of each other's way. They are content to coexist. Now, cocooners are not bad people. They go to work. They pay their taxes. They shovel the snow, to the edge of their property line. They are comfortable with VCRs. They arrange life in patterns that suit their personal interests. They are not people who engage in public life or are all that much concerned about moral complexity unless it affects their personal circumstances, their immediate family perspectives. The fifth group, and the one to which I think we can best pursue, is that to become collaborators in this world. It is to collaborate with people with whom we share life, both in our churches and in our society at large, so that we can create a better future. It is time for us to redeem the negative orientation that has come out of past world wars about collaboration. Collaborators are people who are committed to cooperate with people. They are give and take people. They are us people. They are ready to be who they are in the modern world, but they are also committed to make room for people who are different from themselves. Collaborators are people who are ready to carve out cultural space for their convictions, but they also understand that no one has the right to impose their views on the whole of a society. They refuse to seek to downsize the world so that it reflects their own perceptions and their self-imaging. Collaborators avoid win-lose scenarios. They have a desire when they are facing racist or gender or sexual issues to somehow find a way to move beyond parochial thinking, to extend themselves to the rights of others. They are people who are ready to be a clear voice in a multi-voice society. But they make clear choices not to shut down the voices of others who share life with them. If we were to look on the conviction-compassion axis and think about this model for responding to diversity in our world, if we see conviction in terms of a high response, tribalizers have profound convictions as well as reclaimers. But when we look on the compassion axis, they are low on compassion. When we look at accommodators, those people who seek to be inclusive, are ready to be quite permissive. They are high on the compassion index. Our cocooners are positioned uniquely in a low posture. And what I'm suggesting as we seek to find our way into the future as the people of God, living in a society that is becoming less and less Christian, that we invite ourselves to see in the life of Jesus this kind of invitation to move in the direction of embracing both conviction and compassion at levels that somehow deal with the permissiveness factor and the judgment factor. Because collaborators are people who are not permissive with themselves. They take a stand, but they are also ready to stand alongside others who are different from themselves. And so the collaborator will say to the accommodator and the cocooner, come on up on the conviction scale. And collaborators will look at tribalizers and reclaimers and say, come on over on the compassion index. Live with neither permissiveness nor judgment. Neither be permissive with oneself, nor instinctively judgmental of others. I will look forward to your reading and response of that model as we think about its implications for being the people of God in the modern world. Before we move to the question phase of our evening, I would like to address one other dimension where biblical clarity and creativity is important for us. Again, the Scriptures and the person of Jesus invite us to express creativity in the midst of our complexity. We have been framing who we are and what we understand life to be in the context of evangelism during these days. I would be of the perspective that the days of booklet evangelism stifled creativity. That when we went through a period in the 70s and edging into the 80s where it was fashionable to talk about the gospel by reading booklets to people, that we not only depersonalized the message, we also drained the creativity out of the gospel. That is not to demean the value of what contributed to our past. And certainly we need to applaud people who found Christ because they encountered booklets. But in an age that is high on the personal, low on the ideological, the booklet will have limited value in terms of making sense out of who God is and what Christ has done. We have also come through a period of time when evangelistically the dominance of the "you must be born again" motif stereotyped evangelism. It is always intriguing to realize that in Jesus' encounter with Nicodemus, he used that expression only one time. Based on patterns, particularly south of the border, that have their way of working their way into Canada, you would think that Jesus put that on a cassette tape and distributed it for all history. But that is not the case. It was just a one-time utterance from Jesus' lips. What we discover when we read the text is that the Scriptures are a rich expression of diversity when it comes to communicating the meaning of the cross and the plan for the Creator of the creation. Very briefly, in a quick sketch, when Jesus articulated his own sense of mission, communicated to us from Isaiah in Luke chapter 4, that day when Jesus left his own home, after having the previous night with his mother and father and brother and sisters, he came to the synagogue and opened up the text and saw his mission in the context of freedom. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he'd been anointed to preach the good news, to release the captives, to set the oppressed free. Freedom is a vehicle for making sense of the gospel in this age. When the Apostle Paul articulated his sense of mission in Acts chapter 26, he talked about turning from blindness and darkness and the power of evil. It was a turning image and metaphor to move away from what has been to what can be. In 2 Corinthians 5, the New Testament gives to us that rich, inviting idea of reconciliation, to move from alienation to harmony, to restoration and peace. Admittedly, we need to lay hands on John chapter 3, where we are invited to think about being a new person, to being born again. But it's interesting that how that language is so contextual to the people in that situation. Two intellectuals, two well-informed religious people, having a very esoteric religious conversation would fit into the seminary halls. The wind blows where it blows. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know where it's going. If you read the text and listen to the language and hear you must be born again, if you listen closely, you can hear organ music in the background of that text. You see, it's the uniqueness of Jesus moving into different situations. But the Bible invites us to creativity in communicating the gospel. Romans 12 uses the image of surrender and commitment. Romans 10, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and thou shalt be saved. This is a text for accountants. You know, it's clear-cut. It's decisive. It's kind of in a little formula. But then we move on to Ephesians 2. By grace you're saved through faith. You don't earn it. You don't beg for it. It comes as a gift. It's an expression of God's mercy to the broken and the alienated. The purpose of that is not just to get a free gift and forget about its source, but it is then to express the good works that are a consequence of life in Christ. That beautiful image in John chapter 5 where a man has been by the pool lame for decades, and Jesus comes and says to the paralyzed man, do you want to be healed? Do you want to be whole? I mean, in contemporary language, it's like going to a hospital and saying, do you want to stay sick for the rest of your life? You see, the gospel is such a counter to that. Do you want to be healed? Do you want to be healthy? I love the image in Revelation chapter 3, where Jesus is pictured knocking on the door of people's lives. You know, knock, knock. Who's there? It's Jesus, and what does he say he wants to do? That he wants to kind of move in so that he can eat meals and share life with people. Do you know eating together is one of the most intimate things we do? Where the treasures of human exchange come to us. Or Jesus saying with extended hands, come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. You see, the Scriptures come to us with incredible imagination. I sometimes think that what we have done with the Scriptures is that we have reduced them to a treasure chest of golden coins. And when we hear of problems, or we hear of needs, or we believe someone wants to encounter Christ, we go to the chest and we say, "Here, let me give you a golden coin. This will cure you. This will be your answer." By contrast, ladies and gentlemen, the Scriptures are like a huge hunk of iron ore that have veins of gold running through them. And the invitation of the Christian life for people who are motivated are to mine the mind of God for the gold of creation and recreation. And so is this historic book that is being culturally challenged adequate for this age? It is a time for us to pick up this book and be unpredictable. Not to repeat old phrases. Not to simply recite again what is known, but to create a curiosity, an intrigue, to understand that it's the Creator of the universe who moves into the 1990s and says, "Be like me. It's okay to use up a little creativity." How do we communicate the gospel in this age? How do we make the message clear? We do not have time to do a profile of Jesus through the Gospels, but we can see some hints of how he works. He goes for supper to a Jewish family where there are codes for washing your hands before you eat, which is not a bad idea. But in this situation, for whatever reason, Jesus did not, and he was chastised for not washing his hands. And what does Jesus say in response to that? Why are you so concerned about the outward appearances of life? Don't you understand that life that really flows comes from the inside? It is time for us to ask Canadians to look at the inside of life, at attitudes, at motives, at thinking, and to see that that is the realm that God would like to bring his presence into and his transforming touch. You see, Jesus was a compulsive teacher. He couldn't make it through a day without an object lesson. And when the disciples were arguing about who would be the greatest, how does Jesus respond to that? With a lecture? With rapping their knuckles for being so dumb? No, Jesus says, don't you understand what greatness is? Greatness is becoming a servant. Greatness is laying down your life for someone. Greatness is surrender to people around you who need a godly touch. This was an evangelism workshop. I would invite you to meet with someone who design and understanding the gospel using words and ideas that you've never used before. It might be that you would begin by framing the presentation of the faith around such ideas as, what's your view? Well, we live in a what's your view world. And you may go to John 6 and that wonderful incident where Jesus didn't have a good day. And in response to his teaching, the passage says that crowds were leaving. The teaching was hard, and it was rejected. And in the midst of people moving away from Jesus, he turns to his disciples and essentially says, would you like to leave too? We'll always be indebted to Peter, who said, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Ladies and gentlemen, Canadians are going in all kinds of directions with their lives. There is more than one way to build an existence. There is more than one way to frame a life with a sense of purpose and significance. And in a pluralistic society, the Christian way is just one way among other ways. One legitimate way among other legitimate ways. So what's your view? How are you constructing your life? What are you risking your future and your existence on? I was thinking the other day about how do we communicate the gospel in our computer age. You know, maybe God is like computer software with a virus check. You know, the image is not meant to reduce people down to human computers. But God knows what software we need. He's the creator of the human frame. He knows what we need for purposeful and right function and understanding and perception. God also knows about human viruses. And He's not bad at cleaning them up. And so often we look at God and we say, you know, don't load your software into me, into my thinking, into how I perceive myself and others and the world in which I live. I can build my life on my own software. Thank you very much. If there is an appeal for us in this age where there is often brokenness and dysfunction and grudge carrying and envy and conflict and alienation, is it not to somehow see the Christian life as an invitation to reconciliation, to restoration, to renewal, to putting those broken pieces randomly somehow floating in the disarray of today's world back into coherence, back into connectedness, back into a sense of design? If I could leave you with one thing tonight, it would be to say, ladies and gentlemen, that as we understand God's revelation for us in this age, as we think about the social complexities that we are going to weave our way through in the coming years, as we seek to be creative in our communication of this historic revelation, I would return again to an invitation to invite you both to conviction and compassion. There are ditches on both sides of the road. And it is possible to go to excess on conviction and end up traveling in the ditch. And it is possible to be so bent on compassion to end up in the ditch on the other side of the road. This evening I would propose to you that conviction and compassion are like two guardrails to buffer and protect. On one edge of the road there is compassion, and on the other edge of the road there is conviction. Religion without conviction is spineless and weak, powerless and indecisive. But religion can also be, without passion. Religion without conviction is like weak tea. It somehow just lays hands on passiveness. On the bright side, conviction brings a sense of clarity and design. It means that questions can have answers and doubts can be resolved. People who have conviction know who they are and what they believe. It checks, the excesses of trivializing tolerance and unexamined inclusiveness. Its readiness to weave purpose into the existence of days and nights. It's conviction that stirs our confidence in God. It can produce a vibrant faith and inspire others to believe too. But ladies and gentlemen, that same religion that's characterized by conviction, if it is without compassion, it can be harsh and judgmental and arrogant and rude. Because without compassion, faith lacks empathy. It blocks out the possibility of seeing God's love and concern. People who have not tasted God's compassion don't know much about the heart of God. They can blindly believe that intolerance is a virtue and that their ways are the only ways to serve God faithfully. Religion with compassion puts a human face on God. Forgiveness becomes attractive. Beginning again is somehow believable. Compassion invites belief without the requirement to get it all right. Compassion keeps God's people on the road and out of the ditch. Left to stand alone, conviction and compassion can become religious villains. When held together, they form a formidable alliance. They protect the people of God from destructive excesses. In the midst of the modern world, the example of Jesus and the invitation of the Scriptures invites us to both. To live with a clear voice in a multi-voice society, but to live with regard for the views of others. To be touched with empathy for people who are different. May God in His grace give us both conviction and compassion. Thanks be to God.